Catherine, of course, had the disadvantage of being a foreigner in the Russia that she was trying to run. But Elizabeth I, her vision of an awareness of the world was absolutely remarkable. And she, in fact, had a John Dee, who was one of her science advisors, draw a map of the world looking down on the North Pole. And I mean, it's the most remarkable thing that you can imagine here in the 16th century. Here's a map, and you show it to modern people, and they can't see what they're looking at because it's a view of the world they don't see. To them, the North Pole is simply a line across the top of a map,
exactly.
the same length as the equator.
Talk about
and that, by the way, is well, exactly. But anyway, Elizabeth, of course, wanted to find the Northwest Passage, which was a way around the top of America. And of course, this search had been going on, really started with her and Martin Frobisher looking from the eastern end, but she sent Drake to find the Northwest Passage from the western end. Now, very few history books even talk about this. I mean, all of the focus is on the eastern side, but Drake's directions under secret orders, and they were secret orders, was to find the western end. And so Elizabeth then gave him secret orders, and he sailed north on this coast of the Americas, and that was why when he took on that Spanish navigator, the navigator took him out into the about 1,000 miles off the coast of the Americas, and then brought him back in order to deal with the ocean currents. And of course, his first landfalls are on the west coast of what is now British Columbia. And he then sailed up the northwest coast here. Now, I got involved in this because there was a fellow who was really interested in Drake and what he was doing in this part of the world. But the problem they had was that when Drake got back to England, and of course Elizabeth, being the clever person that she was, put it out that Drake was a pirate, and she really had no control on him, which is absolute nonsense. Drake was an incredibly well-educated man and very, very knowledgeable, spoke a couple of languages, as Elizabeth did. Elizabeth spoke at least 5 languages, including Welsh and Greek and Latin. And but anyway, so Drake was sent by her to find this Northwest end. He then, once he'd found what he thought was the Northwest Passage on this end, it's the Sikine River. It doesn't actually go right through. But he was then also had to do his round-the-world trip. So he set off on that. When he got back to England, Elizabeth met him on board the ship, ordered him not to land at Plymouth, ordered him directly to London, and went on board, and she had the French ambassador with her, which was done deliberately because she knighted him. But the reason she had the French ambassador on board was because Philip of Spain was very angry at what Drake was doing of plundering his gold and so on. And in a very typical Elizabeth move, she said, look, the king wants his gold back, and I'm going to give it to him, but, I don't know how much gold you've got. In other words, you take what you want, and we'll give the rest of it back to him. But she also took all of his charts and graphs and records, logbooks, and the logbooks were then altered for this west side of North America. And what they did was they they changed it by 10 degrees of latitude because she didn't want the Spanish to know how far north Drake had actually traveled on this west coast. And so, as I said, that story in itself is one of the most incredible stories about learning about the world. And of course, what Elizabeth's objective was geopolitical, because she realized if she could control the Northwest Passage, she could then control the North Atlantic, and she could control the North Pacific, because the more southerly latitudes had already been ceded to Spain and Portugal. And if she controlled the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, she effectively controlled the Northern Hemisphere. Part of this is that they were also looking for a way around the top of Russia. in other words, a northeast passage. And there's quite a few records of ships that got lost on those kinds of things. But these were attempts to try and understand the world, to map the world, and to get a better understanding of the whole ocean. And of course, nobody better for that task than Sir Francis Drake.
Now, was this new information you found out about Sir Francis Drake? Is this that gentleman who wrote the new book on Sir Francis Drake?
Yes, well, it was Sam Balfe was the author of the book, and of course his concern, and this is what we talked about in that book on peer review, was that Sam has no degrees. And the prevailing historical wisdom is that Drake landed and discovered San Francisco, and there's no evidence to support that at all. In fact, one of the greatest hoaxes in West Coast history is that a plaque was found, supposedly left by Drake, but it was actually a forgery done to fool the academics. And of course, Sam was, as he dug into this, and he really did his homework. For example, one of the critical things was that Drake, frustrated by, here he thought he found the Northwest Passage, which he considered a more important discovery for his career than making a trip around the world, because Magellan had already done that.
Apparently, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, got to cut in. Apparently, from my last interview with Gavin Menzies regarding the book 1434, he even is saying that the European Renaissance, that all these guys had maps already. They had Chinese maps. And anyway, you should hear that one. And the public, I want to tell you, you should hear the show that Dr. Tim Ball and I did with Gavin Menzies, who wrote 1421 and 1434 on peer review. Very important to open up the realm of discovery and to enhance more exploration and to open up receptivity to new discoveries. It's a really important show to listen to. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, well, and of course, one of the things we didn't mention on that program, we should mention now, is that having this information of where to sail and directions and so on, and sharing that information and the charts was very, very, very important and powerful knowledge to have. In fact, one of the interesting the biography, or I think one of the best biographies on Columbus, was done by Samuel Eliot Morison. Now, he was an American admiral, a very famous admiral in the Second World War, who became a historian after the war, and particularly on marine exploration, and wrote, I think, as I say, the definitive biography on Columbus. And one of the stories in that is that Columbus, there was a guy who reportedly knew about where to go and what was beyond the Azores and out into the Atlantic Ocean, and that this guy was a guest at Columbus's house for a weekend, and then he died of food poisoning while he was there. And the suspicion is that Columbus got the information from him and then bumped him off. Now, that's say, a suspicion and speculation. But the fact that Elizabeth swore Drake to secrecy is very important. And by the way, another measure of how this information was shared, when Cook came to the west coast of North America 200 years after Drake, he clearly was given information on what Drake had discovered. He was clearly given directions and information. And of course, now we're back to the story about Drake being frustrated by wanting to get credit for what he'd done. And after Elizabeth swore him to secrecy, he took off to Europe and met with the world's top map maker at that time, and gave him all the information that he had, so that the map maker, within months of Drake's visit, produced a whole new map of the world that showed islands off the west coast. So in other words, Drake was saying, well, I'm not giving any secrets away, but, and by the way, it's called the French map, and there's a picture of Drake on it. But one of the critical things with that, Kim, was that Drake had used a method of determining longitude that was done long before the Harrison chronometer and all of those sorts of things. And in the new map that was produced when after Drake's visit,